Okay, so today we're resuming our discussion of responsiveness within CSS. Yesterday, you were introduced to a couple of concepts to be able to discuss and learn about media queries and to get a sense of how that fits into the design of an interface. Today, we are talking about our rems and pixels and kind of comparing those responsive units to the fixed units of pixels. So we're going to dive into each of those. And let me pull up a screen. So far, we have been using primarily pixels to be able to describe the size of our elements, whether that's fonts or shapes or images. All of those things are given those fixed dimensions. But those fixed dimensions have problems for accessibility and problems for responsiveness in the browser. For people who have different screen sizes or have their browsers resized within their screen. So let me share this screen with you. And here we go. This is just a code pen that I had before. I'm going to use it to talk about some of these elements. So first, pixels. Pixels are responsive to a browser's zoom, but they're not responsive to a user's settings. And we'll demonstrate a little bit about that in a second. They can be used in the box model, and we typically use pixels or points for fonts for describing their size. And that's what we have used typically so far. So we can see in this CSS here, I don't know if you can see that very well. But we've got our height of elements in pixels, our width in pixels, and typically we've had our font size in points, which equate to the same thing as pixels. So by declaring these things as a size, as you notice when I zoom in on the browser, those font sizes change, but that hasn't always been the case with browsers, and it isn't fully accessible for people who need to make browser level adjustments to their interfaces, and so that they don't have to do a zoom in on their browser every time they need to make sizes. So that's one of the considerations for when we think about these responsive units. Some of those considerations are people with specialized browser needs in order to be able to see things better, so bumping up the size, for example. So some of the other units that we can use then are EMs, which is EM. It's standing for the M size of a specific font, and that font for EMs is gathered from the parent element. So let's look at what that means. If we have a 1M size font, pull this out a little bit. If you notice the change there, let's give this a name. So we'll call this div ID equals example, and then paragraph we're going to do example, and font size is, we'll make that 16 pixels or 16 points. Now we'll go to the example. So that shouldn't have been a class. This is an ID I made. Sorry about that. So for ID, $. So we have a paragraph within example. So I'm going to say example. And then P. Get that again. Font size is 1M. So if I have inside that div this text written, actually what I want to do is make it a paragraph, and we're going to make this a unique class. Demonstrate this a little bit better. Class equals example P. Okay, I think this is not refreshing, so I need to refresh this. Okay, that's one of the problems we're seeing. Okay, we have our text, which is the default size of whatever's in example. We've got our example font size of 16 points or pixels, and we have example P, which is set at 1M. So if I put, you can see they're the same size because it's referring back to that original. 1M is equal to the parent item's font size. So if I put 1.5 here, actually we'll make this a little more dramatic size difference, 3 M's. So it's taking the font size of its parent element and expanding on that and making it 3 times as big. So it's basically 1M is equal to that font size of 16 points. So if I take this and half the size of this font size, then the rem or the M is going to reduce that size based on that parent font. Does that make sense? Any questions about that so far? Flip side of. So the next element we want to talk about is rem, which is REM, and that stands for the root M. So rather than referencing just its parent element, the rem is going back to the root or the HTML level in the tag structure, the HTML level element and what that font size is. So usually you're declaring a font size at the HTML level for your site. And so the rem references that rather than its parent element or beyond. So in this case, let's add one more class here. We'll duplicate this, copy and paste. And we're going to call this at example rem. And let's say item 2. We give another class example, or see example rem font size 1 rem. Okay, you can see that this is the default in the browser for rem is going to be 16 points or 16 pixels, and that's adjustable when you do your own CSS at the HTML level. But you can see this example 2, which is based on the rem or the root M size of the font, then it is at 16 point because that's at 1 rem. So if I were to go to the HTML and say font size is 26, then as you can see, it's actually adjusted all of the fonts because we're going back to that root level. But you can also see that this one has increased to that size. And then if I go to 0.5, that reduces just that one element to half the size of the default font size for that HTML document. Any questions about rem? Okay. We can also deal just in straight percentages, and that percent is a responsive unit as well. And we can use the percentage often for building responsive layouts, and it's not used so much as for font scaling. So percent helps us build out based on the viewport width, and then we can cascade down within the nested structure of our units. So let's take this. I'm going to take down that font size to be normal again. Oops. And get that back to normal size. So if we are dealing with our divs in this class right side, we can look at this right side, and we've got a width of 500 pixels. We can change that to a percentage of the screen size. So if I want it to take up just 10% of the screen, then I reduce that size that way. Let's close this out so we can see this. That allows us to say whatever screen size that I'm at, that right-hand side box is always going to be at 10% of the width of my viewport. And that's basically our most likely use of percentage, and it's really going to be referencing the objects we have on our page. With objects, within objects as well, we can use that, and it will use that percentage based on the box that it's in. So if it's in the main box, it'll be percentage of that main tag. If it's within a div within the main, then it'll be percentage of that div. So it's referencing whatever it's nested under as a way to gather that percentage. There are other responsive units as well. Those are called VW and VH. With viewport width, it's very similar to how we think of percentage, but it is going to be referencing the viewport at all times rather than in a nested format. And it's not really something that you would often use in most of your layout. It's just a good thing to know about. And likewise, viewport height, it's also going to be something you don't necessarily use for fonts. And it is in basically a percentage of the viewport height. So you can, if you know that you're going to have a specific height of a phone example, or device that somebody's using, then you can use that height to be able to resize any element on that page in order to make it reference that viewport height. Right. Any questions about these units? We've talked about our pixel as a way to designate something's size. We've talked about M's and we've talked about rems. Who can tell me the difference between an M and a rem?
An M uses an M uses a parent to get a size, and then a RAM uses its own. So it's a group.
Okay, great. Yeah, the difference is rem is for the root font size, and M is referencing its parent element's font size. Good. Percentages and viewport widths, and viewport width and viewport height as other elements as well. And those are basically written like, wouldn't we do that? Width would be written rather than as a percentage, it would be 10 VH or 10 VW. So in this case, 10 VW is essentially doing the same thing as 10% would, but VH is different because it's comparing against the height. So it's 10% of that height.
And sorry, what do VH and VM stand for?
So VH stands for viewport height, and VW is the other one. I'm sorry if I said VM, but it's VW is viewport width.
Okay.
So it can calculate, the browser can calculate whatever viewport is that somebody's using, and then take a percentage of that, and then you can reference that as either direction as a width or a height for one of your elements on page. Any other questions about that? Look at Slido again. Nothing there. So let's talk a little bit about why we have these responsive units, why they matter, and primarily the reason we want to consider these responsive units is because of accessibility, usually in terms of visual perception of what's in our interface, and user experience, because we can be responsive to the device that the user's in, and then we can respond with our CSS to be able to create a better experience depending on how the viewer is using the website. So let's talk a little bit about pixels, because pixels are not inherently bad, because even though it's basically putting a set width and a set size to something, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just doesn't allow users to control their browser settings to have the fonts specifically respond to those settings. And let's look a little bit about how this interaction might be happening on an example of pixel-based font is in ESPN.com. We look at their H1 here, and we go down to our CSS, and we look through. I'll bump that up so you can see a little bit better. We're looking for the font size, and we come here and we see that it's been hard coded in as 22 pixels. Now, if I bump up, oops, accidentally clicked on some interaction. So if I bump up the size of this page, the modern browser will show that as a larger size. So somebody could come and then bump up the size, and it will increase. So that does work when you're using pixels. And that's good behavior with the browser, but that's something that not all browsers, most modern browsers can, but earlier browsers couldn't. And if someone's still using an older browser, that sometimes is a problem for them. But it's not as accessible as many people need when they're dealing with browser and visual acuity issues. Accessibility by using REM. So here's an example of both REM and M in use in irs.gov. So if we inspect these navigation elements and then scroll down, we can find font size of 1.25 rem, and that's referencing the root. If I inspect this element, I scroll down and find font size. They're using rem there as well. Earlier when I was checking, it looked like they had used M, but they're using rem in most of these places. So it looks like rem is, as we said, referring to the root element. And what that allows you to do, if in your browser settings, there's a setting that allows people to change the font size to very small or very large according to their personal needs. So if I change the browser settings to very large, you can see this page increased in size. If I go back to the IRS page, all of those fonts have also increased in size and are responding to my needs as a user who have set my browser settings to be a specific size, so that whenever I come to a site, it's showing me the font size that I need. If we go back to ESPN and we refresh the browser size, even though my browser settings are set at extra large, it's still coming in as the pixel size that they designated. So this is how we begin to see that there's accessibility benefits from using REM, and that's recommended usage whenever you're doing font sizes, is to go and use REM so that when people are coming to their site, if they have their browser settings set to larger size, it will automatically go to that larger size. As developers and user experience designers, we want to consider the many types of accessibility that we need to consider as we build. So in our designs, we're thinking color and contrast, and then font size to be able to accommodate for that. As a user experience designer, sometimes we'll design things at a specific size, and that's usually smaller, but being able to communicate with developers to ensure that they're thinking accessibility, so that they're designing in REMs rather than in pixels that can expand those designs. And you knowing as a designer that when your designs are viewed in some of those situations, that it will be bumped up, and so making considerations for that and how that will impact other elements on the page. So other things that we deal with, the semantic HTML, so that people with screen readers can read through those and understand the meaning of the content without a lot of additional material. Alt tags on images, responsive units, all of these things add up to be a better, more accessible experience across many devices. What questions do you have about the impact of these responsive units on accessibility? Anything I can help clarify?
It's not so much a question, but you sometimes break up a lot, and it seems to be worse today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like sometimes I think we still are getting the like bulk of the information, but sometimes towards the beginning of your explanations, there's like a good minute or two of like, I'm not really sure what was said there. I just, yeah, wanted you to be aware of that.
Okay, I apologize. So
No worries.
if we hit those points and it's not coming through, I'm not seeing it on my end, so I apologize. But if definitely pause me and say, can you repeat that? And I'm happy to do that to help with any of those things. Any other questions? Anything that I can clarify that maybe got garbled in the internet somewhere? Okay. So there's, for the most part, as I mentioned, we will be using rems and percentages for our CSS. And we'll use rem for more fixed items and fonts, and then percentages for layout changes. And there's one little tricky detail of working with rem. Since the default browsers, as I mentioned, are set at 16 pixels for those base fonts, then that means then the default settings are, when you have one rem, it's 16 pixels on your font. And that can be kind of annoying to try to convert your rems into whatever font size you're dealing with because of that difference of 16 pixels for one. So you can actually do a little trick in your HTML and CSS that allows you to make that conversion process a little bit easier. And that is by changing your font size at the HTML level. We're going to change that font size to 62.5%. If you do the math, if you multiply 16 pixels by 62.5%, that ends up at 10. So it makes the base font for one rem at 10 pixels. And that makes doing just adding rems for all of your fonts so much easier. So I just made that change. Everything changed up here. And if I go down to one of these places where I put one rem, so the rem will be 10 pixels. And if I want my font size to be 8 pixels, then I would just be able to put 0.8 rem. Or if I want it to be 18 pixels, I put 1.8 rem. And 3 rem would be 30 or 3 rem would be 30 pixels. So that just becomes a really easy way to do a conversion. It's not necessary, it's not required by any means, but just as you're trying to convert font sizes, that's a really handy tip to be able to make those conversions more easily. Put that in there. Any questions about that? Okay, let's talk a little bit about responsiveness, because we've got our responsive units that we can now use. We're fairly comfortable with them, unless you tell me otherwise, and we're ready to start implementing our responsive CSS. But we want to sort of talk about how you approach coding responsive design as well as designing responsively. And that is, the concept is mobile first. That's a catchphrase you've probably heard before. When we first started learning responsive design, we covered mobile first as a best practice, so that we, because it's easier to work with in the smallest amount of content and work up from there, helps us to be able to hone in on the most important elements, and then from there we can expand out into providing additional detail or a different layout in order to accommodate. And when we're coding responsive interfaces, we also want to follow that same process. And we do it because it's easier to work with less content and then work our way up. And it's also conceptually easier to implement it within the code because of the way the media queries work. And we can have our base styles handle mobile and all of the shared styling, and then we add media queries to expand to larger breakpoints. So in our training kit, there are a couple of examples of why that might be the case. So we have an example here of mobile first coding, and we get our Flex containers all set up, and then we add a media query of min width, and that is saying that when the minimum width reaches 800 pixels, then we make these adjustments to the Flex container and we justify content. And then we have width and a sidebar width that then create. So when we, oops, I need to make this a little bit smaller so we can see those changes. So we have the mobile version and then a desktop, just reducing the zoom by 0.5 there. We can see that there's a little less coding we have to do when we take this mobile first approach versus when we take a non-mobile first approach. Then we're doing the reverse type of adding those distances. So max width at 800 pixels, then we have to add some additional pieces to that in order to bring back that mobile first design. So it's a little bit of an efficiency issue, but it's generally good practice to think mobile first, both in design and in our coding, so that we can build up from a good foundation to those larger sizes. All right, hopefully you've been following along a little bit. What parts of this make you uncomfortable, knowing that you'll be jumping into doing some design or some coding using rems, percentages? We'll be spending the rest of class doing some demonstration of how we use those in our project. But I want to get a feel for you for what, if any of that intimidates you or feels confusing at all.
How are we going to apply this for design? Should we like communicate the sizes in rem or m with the developers, or should we just keep going with pixels and they can figure it out?
Typically, you are going to be setting your type scale out, and the developers should know how to set up that and be able to use that with rem and then build out. What we're helping you understand from the design side is how you can interact with them and knowing what they need in order to get done their work. And if you open up the browser as doing a usability test and you look at it and they've hard coded the pixels, you can have a conversation about, hey, what if we use rems that'll add to accessibility? So this is more of a knowledge that you can help have those conversations with developers, as opposed to you needing to tell them directly in your interface which one that they're using, because it should be standard practice at most places where they would be automatically doing these things. Does that make sense? Am I answering the question you're asking?
I think so. Well, we'll wait for the practice and we'll see if I have another.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions right now? Okay, before we jump into the demo, I want to go ahead and take just a quick 5-minute break. So let's go ahead and do that, and we will come back again in 5. Okay, we are back. All right, I thought, let's see. I just copied and pasted, I thought, the code that you worked on yesterday. But this doesn't look quite right, so let me try this again.
I had a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I get that we're using the REM and percentages for responsive design to a certain degree. To what extent would you say are we using these in addition to the like app media that we learned yesterday, or are we using it instead of? How is that working?
Great question. It is in addition to, and so what the media queries help the browser recognize when you hit a certain percentage or certain location on screen width, that then it should read different CSS. And with that different CSS, we're able to provide REMs and percentages that better are able to respond within the difference between those media breakpoints. So from 600 to 1000, you will still be expanding by 400 pixels. And within that, then we can use percentages to help deal with the space, and REMs will pretty much stay relative to whatever that particular breakpoint is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we'll be using the REMs and percentages both inside that app media command and also outside of, it's like throughout the CSS, just instead of the pixels.
Right,
or the
exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Ooh, percentages. I love math.
Yeah, I think as we get into it, maybe that'll feel a little bit more natural as we go. So I don't know if I got the wrong code. Does this seem like this is where we left off? You left off yesterday in terms of what the design should look like?
We don't see your screen.
Oh,
I don't see the
sorry,
screen,
yeah,
yeah.
stop sharing.
Not yet.
Yeah. Soon.
Oh no, we're
Yeah.
way ahead.
That's what I thought. So I am wondering what's missing here. Did anybody follow along yesterday that you could grab?
I can send you the files if you want to.
Sure, if you DM me those files. I mean, it looks like we have media query stuff in here, but something's not matching with the code. So am I on the right page? Okay. Thanks, Ivan. Let me insert this and see if this.
I did not catch
Works.
anything you just said after thanks, Ivan.
Okay. I just said, let me paste this in and see if it gets us to where we need to be.
Cool.
It's looking about the same, but something is not right. Still. So let me see. So when you, Ivan, when you pull up your browser, it looks different from this. Like you had cards in place already, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, that looks almost complete. The main CSS and even has some color purples there. I saw. So you should be able to have what I have.
Sorry, Ivan, I can't hear what you're saying.
That I saw that you even have the color purples around, so you should be able to see what I see. I'll maybe save it and refresh it again.
Yeah.
We made some changes to the HTML yesterday as well. Did you update the HTML or just the CSS?
I thought I had updated both, but let me see.
See, it even has the meta. So I mean, it should be updated. The meta.
Sorry about this, everybody. Wonder if that was a big issue, is my settings were wrong. Let's see, go to dashboard, fresh. So interesting.
It looks like we just need to debug the CSS, and that should.
Need to what? Say that again.
It looks like we just need to debug the CSS. It looks like there's some errors because I was thinking maybe the CSS is not linked up to the HTML, but I see the border, the box shadow there, so it is connected. I think we just need to make some
Figure out.
changes. Yeah, figure out what's causing the errors. So
So let's see if we inspect.
mm,
So what is that from? Okay, copy this one more time. Got it.
I mean, I even put it in the code pen just now, and even in the code pen, it's working. I don't know what's going
So
on.
weird. Let me see if. Okay, I'm gonna quit Chrome and see if that helps. Restart it. Well, that didn't help. So why don't we just walk through this together and see if we can all recognize what's going on in the code at least, and be able to then maybe troubleshoot together what's going on. So we have, you see my screen again?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. All right, I have my doc type, HTML. I have my HTML, I have my head that has the meta information. So I have my viewport width, device width, and scale 0. Let's see. Get this. All right, so employee, we've got my meta viewport, then we're linking to the font family. We've got our style sheet, main.css that's linked. We have the body, then a header section, the nav, div, ID logo, div class, nav links. Get to there, close out the div, close out the nav, header. Have our main section, which has section main, and then there's sections within the main. Each of the class of 2 what we would call flex items, because we're using flex. So we have our image and then our div. Each of those second divs has the H2, H3, A, and looking over those, each of those sections seems to be the same, have the same elements. And we have a footer section, goes out the body, HTML. So it looks like it should be fine. So what's happening in our CSS? So we have box sizing, border box, text decoration none, the font family Lotto, the sans serif is the fallback. We have a body, the background, and a margin of 0. The logo is an ID. Font size is 21 pixels. Font weight is bold. Color should be purple. Letter spacing is 0.5 pixels. And already I'm seeing an issue.
Christian, can we check in the HTML if it's a class or an ID for the logo?
Yeah. So the logo.
Oh, it is an ID.
Yeah, apply.
Weird.
Let's see. Style sheet href main.css. Main.css.
Okay.
Is anyone else noticing anything of concern?
Can you maybe scroll down here to this area?
Expected CSS.
I'm not sure if it's. I know for me it works when there's a space between the @media and the parentheses, but what if we close the gap?
So I'm just going to look at that.
You need a semicolon at the end where the pixels are, like 768.
Right in there.
Yeah.
It's not giving me data only screen.
Yeah, mine works without the semicolon at the end of there.
Yeah,
It should work.
it's
Doesn't VS Code has like a debugging button?
what is that? Say that again.
Doesn't VS Code has like a debugging feature?
I have not used VS Code enough to know its features for debugging, but it's got these little error messages.
Yeah, I've actually never used it too. This one, the debugger, I've never used it. Yeah, these squiggly lines are usually tell me what's wrong.
Yeah. So this is so theoretically.
I wonder if this space here on the left side, I wonder if that is maybe causing it.
This space on
Right,
which side?
40, line 40.
Say that again. Sorry.
On line 40.
The space in between media and
The space between right here to the left of media. Yeah, I can't see it.
so all of these media queries are saying 768. It doesn't seem like that would be right. So what would this one be? Is that right?
We use that because that's the width of a iPhone.
But how come there are 3 media queries that all say min width 768? Did you?
Yeah, Nick said we're gonna use 768 since that's like the common thing to do instead of using like 800 or 900 something like that.
I don't think that's the thing though. It's like there's no need to use it more than once.
Yeah, that's kind of my question is, normally you put all of your media queries in a single query, and then we would have one for 768, one for 1024 or something like that. But because we have under this media min width 768, then we have nav A, and let's see.
We were placing them close to the code, so that
Okay, so
there were several different queries, but they were all like related to. So like that
within that, okay,
queries related to that nav A.
Gotcha. All right. Okay, so I can't figure out what's going on with my browser and this, and I don't want to waste time. So what let's do is I'm going to try to troubleshoot this for a little bit on my own, but what I want you to do is use a code pen, or actually use your version of this code that's working for you. And I want you to go in and change all font sizes to be rems. And so find the equivalent, do that trick that we talked about, the point, or 64.2%. I can't remember the percentage right on, but set that up in your main code, and then put your rems in, make them equal to what the design would look like. And then hopefully as you're doing that, I'm going to try and keep troubleshooting here and figure out what's going on with my browser. But I want you to be actively working on some code while I'm doing that. And we'll come back to that in just a second. So go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing for the moment, but I'll still be on. If you hit something and you have a question about it, let's talk about it. But otherwise, let's just work on putting those rems in, and then we can get into this and try to do some percentages and layout issues if I can figure this out.
Christian. I actually got it to work. It's kind of weird.
Okay, what's up?
Yeah, I just put everything in one media query and put it all the way at the bottom.
Had you been having the same problem I was having before? Or?
Yeah. So I asked Ivan to send me the same code, and I tried it on VS Code, and I was getting the same exact error. And for some reason, it was working during the demo yesterday. I'm having like 3 media queries, and that typically works for me as well. But I don't know why, but moving everything in one media query, putting it all the way at the bottom, that fixed it for me.
Okay, let me try that. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, it's not working for me again. I'm gonna try one more thing. That still didn't work for me. Gabe, will you send me your code that you made? The changes.
Yeah, sure, 1 second.
Oh, I just copied and pasted from Ivan's code pen and it worked. I don't know what's going on with the copy and paste from Slack, but I think maybe it's introducing some errors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you, Ivan and Gabe, both for your help. I appreciate that.
So it worked from the code pen, but not the direct file?
Not from the files that I was copying from Slack. So and I tried to copy and paste it in text edit at first as well, paste it, but yeah, I'm like blowing my mind with craziness. So
that must be something going on with the metadata from Slack.
yeah, that's what I think.
Wow,
So,
weird.
okay, so let's jump into doing more demo as much time as I can get in here, and I apologize again for that. I've never seen that or experienced that before, and I apologize. So, all right, let me share the screen again. Okay, how did it go getting some REMs and things going?
I guess I'm still a little bit confused about where or what the like root element is and like how to identify that.
So the root would be essentially at the HTML level. So the HTML tag, that is the root of our document. And so browsers by default will display that root font as 16 points. So text, if there was no declarations by me, then the root is 16 pixels for a font. That is the default size of text font size. So if I want to override that, then I do that at the HTML tag level in my CSS. So font size and 62.5, is that right? Does anyone remember off the top of their head?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another thing.
So that's something that we have to set before we can like start adding, like adjusting the REMs elsewhere in the code.
If you want an easier time converting your fonts to their sizes easily, then you do this to make the default size 10 pixels for the font. And that will then make it easy for you to just say, if you want a 12-point font, then it's 1.2 REMs. If you do it with 16 pixels, then you have to do some math and convert it from 16 pixels to 21 pixels or 22 pixels, and that becomes like 1.7 RAM or something, some random number. But if you just do this trick, that makes it easier. It's not required, but it just makes the coding easier. Did I answer your question?
I think so. Yeah.
And so just thinking about the root is you're referencing whatever you set that root at. If you don't set it at anything, then it'll be referencing 16 points. If you set it at this 62.5%, then it will be 10 points or 10 pixels. And you could send it to 30 pixels if you want. You could make that root anything you want in that tag, the HTML tag.
Clarifying question. So at 62.5, we are increasing or decreasing by 10 pixels at every line, at every page break? Is that what we're saying?
So this declaration here is saying that I want my root font size to be 62.5% of what the actual root size is currently. And so we're saying at 62, and if you do a math thing, 62, sorry, if we want 16 points times 0.625, which is 62.5%, that equals 10. So that's what we're doing, is basically saying from now on, the root font size is 10 pixels. And that way, when I reference it, if I'm saying 1 rem, that means I want a 10 pixel size font. If I'm saying 2 rem, I want a 20 pixel size font. If I want a 22 pixel size font, I would say 2.2 rem, because 2.2 times 10 is 22 pixels. So all I'm saying right here in this declaration is this, I want my font size to now be 10 pixels at the root. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Awesome, great. Okay, so let's go back through our code now. We have some places where our font size is declared as pixels or points. So this one, I basically want it to be 2.1 rem. Come down and see if there's any additional ones. When we think about whether we want to change sizes to pixels or percentages, with the box shadow, we're always pretty much wanting that box shadow to be that distance away from the edge of the border of that box. So I'm always going to say, let's keep this as a pixel size because I don't want to make that flexible based on how somebody zooms in on the browser. The same with my padding at the moment. And then my nav links. Here's another nav A font size, and in this one, 16 points. So I'm going to go ahead and change that to 1.6 rem. Letter spacing for nav A. Because it's such a small amount, I probably am not going to mess with this right now. And then margin left, 20 pixels. It's probably going to be good. Looks like there's a typo here. Should be margin left. Nav image. Because this nav image, we will always want it about that size rather than decreasing and enlarging as well. We make that a pixel instead of a percentage. Section A, font size 16, so 1.6 rem. We're seeing any other font sizes? Font size for card H2.
Yeah, that one.
Okay, 2.1 rem. So all the changes I've made are basically just to convert the existing font size to the new font, or just to a rem.
And that
so,
line that you're on right now.
All right, great. 1.6 rem. If I refresh this, there were no changes to the visibility because of my because I'm not actually changing the font size, I'm just changing the reference to the rem. But what benefits that gives us now is if I go to my settings and I do that very large font size again, then I go back to my employee dashboard and it's automatically based on my browser settings, enlarging the font according to that setting. So this is primarily for accessibility reasons, to provide value to those who need that enlargement in their browser. That's their preference. So I'm going to go ahead and change that setting back to medium. Goes back to its original size. Now we have our
so one thing, so the browser itself is basically telling the base size of the HTML, and that's what the rem is for. So it switches based upon that.
Right. Yeah. So when I'm changing my browser settings, I'm making some unique unique changes that nobody else would view. It's just within my browser, but yeah, it's telling that root element, this is the size of that font, or that root M. Yeah. Okay, so let's do some additional coding to try to get this design to look like our example design. which is not that. Employee markups. So I want to put these here. So again, as we did done this coding, thinking mobile first, and this is the design essentially that our mobile devices are going to serve up for us. So I'm going to go back to my inspect. I'm going to select this, and we're going to make some changes to our code to help bring that design closer to what that's meant to be. Let's go to 6, 7, and 8. So our cards are meant to be having this image on the left and then the name and contact information. And the card is meant to fill most of the space. We have distance between there of 20 pixels on either side. This size. And right now there's a fairly inconsistent spacing on those cards. So we will come back to our mobile size of the card. Let's see. Right now we have a margin of 28 pixels. Then we can actually experiment with our browser here. Inspecting this card. Styles. So let's change the margin to see what difference that makes. So by changing that margin to auto, we've basically removed the margin from the top and then centered the cards at their existing width with even margins on the left and the right. And that's not necessarily the look that we want, right, compared to our design. If we look at our design again, the spacing they have is 20 pixels above and then on either side. So if we were dealing with pixels, then that might be an easy thing to do. If we go back to margin 20 pixels. Oops, that's not the one I wanted to look at. Refresh that. We're getting not the width that we want. So let's change and do the card width at 80%. See what that looks like. Refresh. We're getting a consistent card width at this point, and the margin on the left is still good, but the margin on the right looks odd. So what we're going to do is we're going to do auto for left and right, and because we want the pixel distance between them to be 20 pixels. Then above and below, we're going to do a margin of 10 pixels. That gives us a combination of 20 pixels in between the cards. So let's see what that looks like. The first card gives us a weird gap between the top and the ones below it. And so we have to rethink, how can we make this feel more consistent? And what you can do is then just make a margin on the top of 20 pixels, and then on the bottom 0 pixels. So I don't know if I went over this or if Nick did, but when we're giving individual pieces of a margin, we can think of the acronym TRBL, TRBL. So it goes top, right, bottom, left. So if I want to make changes to individual margins different from each other, then I can use that as a way to think about that. So top margin will be 20 pixels, then right will be auto, then bottom will be 0 pixels, and then because I've done auto for right, it will be automatically auto is for left as well, so I can leave that blank. But that gives us the consistent height from the top down of the margin of those cards in this mobile view. Now we can see that the left and right margins are not quite right. So I think we're going to go with 90% margin, see what that looks like. And that gives us fairly consistent, or sorry, 90% width. That gives us consistent margins on the left and right, and then in between each card. Let's look at our sketch diagram. That's really about the size that we're dealing with for the card design. So that's one way to use width percentage. And now let me look at responsive. Relative to the size of the screen, it's maintaining a fairly consistent margin. Because the percentage grows a little bit as you get bigger, then that margin on either side grows a little bit bigger. But for the purposes of responsive design, that can be a good acceptable solution, going from that breakpoint that has been defined by a designer. Then you can just use a percentage to be able to help that grow and get that point. So any question about anything I've done so far? So as we move to a different breakpoint, that width and margin becomes a problem because it's not fitting that. So then you can go to those specific media queries, and instead of doing width of 275 pixels, we can do something like 40% and see what that looks like. Refresh that. Go back to responsive. We kind of see that we're getting about 40% of the screen of that enclosing container. But that feels a little bit weird for what our designs are supposed to look like. So let's look back at the design again. So what are your thoughts based on what we've discussed so far of a good way to try to get these cards to maintain about this same appearance and flow within a responsive design? Any thoughts, any ideas?
What was the question again?
I'm just asking, how do you think, based on what you know so far about the way percentages work, or the way our responsiveness works, how would you code this card for this media query in order to keep it from or to keep it in line with what the design looks like? So this is what the design layout looks like.
Did we have the wrapping on there? The flex wraps?
Okay, so on main, we have flex wrap. So looking back at the code, let's see, main, then each of the flex items are the section, the class card. So it would wrap once the elements are equal to 100%, basically, it wraps to the next page.
Hmm.
Mine is wrapping though. Like whenever I get it wider, I do get the 4 cards in a row.
And have you changed the width at all? Because right now what I've done.
I have the same exact things as you do for both card and the at media for the card. I had it at 40% for the at media, and then the width 90% on the card.
Okay. 40%. I'm going to
This is the weirdest thing ever. Because I am looking at side by side, and we have the same code, but mine is working.
I feel kind of haunted today. I don't know if you feel like that. But.
And I have it on the inspect tool, on responsive, and I mean, it's working. And if I keep going, getting wider and wider, it just goes into a single line.
Interesting. Okay, so we are close to the top of the hour, and let's review our assignment for today, and then let's see. We'll review our assignment for today, and then I will make myself available this afternoon as you're doing your assignments to try to answer any questions, because I feel badly for the technical difficulties we were having. I do have a meeting with my team, but I can be flexible around that as well. But definitely don't want to leave you hanging if you're feeling like we haven't covered this material sufficiently for the assignment. So let's get that assignment first thing, and then we will come back and regroup. Okay, so there's a code pen that you can go to, and within the code pen, again, are instructions that you step through and work on to make the changes for making this responsive and using those elements. So once you complete that code pen, you add it to your Google Doc, and then there are stretch goals for using the same thing that you worked on yesterday to begin improving that work. Jump to step 3 if you didn't start yesterday, but just go following through that with the mobile first approach for your responsive CSS. Add a breakpoint at 1,000 pixels, and image assets are there, and the submission as per usual. So with that, let's take a break, everybody. If you want help specific to this design, just go ahead and DM me, and I'll set up a time to chat with you. If we have a bunch of people having the same concerns, we can maybe group everybody together. But for now, I want you to go ahead and take a break, take lunch, and then when we come back into it, let's sync up, and I do my best to help you with whatever roadblocks you hit, so that we can help you understand this material. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties in there. Any last questions or concerns before we part ways? All right. If not, then thanks everybody. Thanks for your patience, and we will talk to you tomorrow.